Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Tarek, I hope I can live up to your very kind words. I first just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for coming to the talk. A big thank you to the Uni of Buckingham and the Centre for organising the seminar. And finally, and most importantly, a big thank you to Tarek and Geopol Report. As Tarek said, Geopol was founded in late 2024 and was the first place that gave a recent grad like me a chance to gain invaluable experience in what I'm sure you'll find out is an increasingly tough job market. Spoiler alert, so sorry about that. But most importantly, Geopol also provided me with my first ever opportunity to write about the country that I find most interesting, which is Cuba, as you can see. So, the presentation is basically full of pictures. I'm going to give a little bit of an explainer on why those pictures are important and why they're relevant for the upcoming presentation. So, as you can see, the first photo is of Havana in the 1950s. Very classic American car, probably a smiling mafioso there, knowing that he's got mojitos and daiquiris on the menu later on, and behind you can see the iconic Hotel Nacional. And that photo is very much indicative of the great power reliance that plagued much of Cuba's 20th century history. First off, there was the United States. Cuba was effectively a colony of the United States between 1898 and 1959, when, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Cuban Revolution swept Fidel Castro to power, and effectively one superpower was traded for another. This is a photo of Soviet sailors cutting down sugarcane, sugar being Cuba's most important commodity at some point, I believe, in the 1960s. And this third photo there is the Plaza Mayor, the sort of central square in Havana today. And the eagle-eyed of you will have noticed that these cars here are very, very similar to the one here in the photo. And why is that? Well, Cuba doesn't really trade. And I know that today is a talk on international trade and its importance, and I thought that one of the best case studies for that is a country that has effectively been cut off from the global economy. Now, because those classic cars have incredible tourist value, it is also true that the Cuban government has invested money in refurbishing them as opposed to buying new cars. So it's not just a story of international isolation. However, Cuba, despite basically being the country least suited to economic self-sufficiency for various reasons which we're going to discuss, has effectively embarked on a 3-decade experiment of autarky that, spoiler alert, may end in the next couple of weeks. So, why will I be focusing on Cuba tonight? There are two main reasons. The first is very much personal and the next is political. So I first visited Cuba in 2022 as part of my year abroad. I was a languages undergraduate. I studied there for 5 months, and upon completing my second exchange semester in Colombia, I decided to return to Cuba for another month for, obviously, research purposes. I loved it. It's a fascinating country. I made incredible friends, and I found the culture and the politics and the history absolutely fascinating. The landscape's incredibly beautiful if you get the opportunity. Actually, I think that Steve Wilkinson organises trips from the University of Buckingham. Please, please, please do visit. It's a real hidden gem. But moving on to the political reasons, most interestingly, I found that Cuba was a country of contrast. And I know that's a cliche, everyone says that about every country, but I think in the case of Cuba, it is more true than it is anywhere else. So what do I mean by that? Well, on a personal level, my newfound friends knew more about Mozart, Nietzsche, Cervantes, and perhaps even Alfred Hitchcock than I could, or any of my university friends could ever claim to know. But many of those same friends had rarely left Havana, the capital of Cuba, let alone the country. This was a country where the food that I ate, as you can see here, was the plainest, blandest, and quite frankly, the worst. but where the cocktails, the drinks, as you can see on the right, the daiquiri, the mojito, and my favorite, the one that you can see there, the wonderfully named canchanchara, which was originally created out of sugarcane and some form of rum by African slaves who were imported to Cuba. The cocktails were the best in the world. And again, another reason to go to Cuba. Bring your own spices, but enjoy the cocktails. So, this is also an island surrounded by an incredibly beautiful, idyllic, nutrient-dense sea. But as my friends would tell me, with equal parts amusement and irritation, it is an island, in their words, con tremendo escasez de pescado y sal, which means a tremendous shortage of fish and salt. One of my friends, actually, we'd go to the beach together, and he would fill up his water bottle full of salt water and let it dry, and that was the salt that he used to season his food. So you're starting to get a picture of the economic situation. This is also a country where people, as you can see in this photo here, have to queue hours for the most basic goods. They have to queue hours for rice, for beans, for chicken, for toilet paper, for everything. And spoiler alert, the quality of the goods that they get is not great in most cases. If you're lucky enough to be in the tourist sector or affiliated with the military or government, as always, the story is a little bit different. So they have to queue for hours for basic goods. They suffer terrible now daily blackouts, lasting up to 20 hours a day. And they live on a monthly salary of about $20. So that's monthly. So they will earn less in a month than I expect most of the people in this room earn in an hour or two. However, this is also a country where everyone can see the most spectacular cultural performances of ballet, theatre, film, all for less than the price of Freddo bar, to use the best English measurement, or a pack of Haribos. And that also counts for Cubans. They can go to places like this, which is the National Theatre in Havana, where I also went and see the most spectacular, wonderful cultural performances for nothing. It is open to everyone. And those Cuban contrasts, ironically, become far more dramatic when you leave the country and you start writing about it, which I've done. To some, especially the Cuban-American exile community, which is principally located in Florida, the island is a Caribbean North Korea, with the only difference being the impressive nature of the Cuban regime to mask its truly monstrous nature. And to others, Cuba is a political paradise, a paragon of socialist one-party democracy. That is a quote from an Italian politician who was serving in the EU, one-party democracy, where civic participation is abundant and inequality and corruption are virtually non-existent. I'm sure that you'll all notice that the common denominator for both groups is their current residence outside of Cuba. So, how does this idea of contrast relate to trade and the topic we're talking about today? Well, on the one hand, Cuba is incredibly resource poor, as I said before, and very much not suited to autarky or economic self-reliance. In 2023, the top exports of Cuba were rolled tobacco, some nickel, some zinc, and hard liquor. In resource terms, Cuba does not have much to give, and in that same year, 2023, Cuba ranked 191st out of 209 countries in exports per capita at $95.7. In addition to being resource poor, Cuba is located 90 miles away from not only the most powerful and important country in the world, but I would argue the most powerful country to have ever existed in human history, which is, of course, the United States, and they don't have great relations. So, basically, what choice does Cuba have as a resource-poor nation but to depend on foreign powers, especially foreign superpowers, for economic stability and potentially prosperity through trade? In other words, its diplomatic and geopolitical ambitions should be completely dictated by its trade relations and, to put it bluntly, the willingness of bigger fish to feed it scraps. And for a while, as these photos show, that was basically the case. This is Eisenhower meeting Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban dictator, before 1959, and this is Fidel Castro with his wonderful beard and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. And obviously that relationship would go on to define one of the most frightening periods of the 20th century, namely the Cuba Missile Crisis. So, until 1991, the story of 20th century Cuba was one of complete trade dependence and over-reliance on external powers. Until 1959, Cuba was beholden to the United States and its most decadent travelers and entrepreneurs who built casinos, clubs, and resorts on the island. The reliance on the US was such that the American mob made Havana its playground because of how easy, or because of the facility of American economic integration onto the island. In 1958, the year before the revolution, approximately 67% of Cuba's exports went to the US, and US products accounted for 70% of the island's imports. So Cuba was effectively a colony. There were also stipulations in the Cuban constitution that allowed for US intervention. Then, as we said before, Cuban Revolution happens. It's a little bit unclear what kind of revolution it's going to be at first, whether it's going to be democratic or Marxist-Leninist. We all know how that story ends. Eventually, Cuba and the USSR reach a trade agreement, and although ideologically this is very significant in terms of trade, very little changes. So, by 1985, trade with the USSR accounts for about 70% of Cuba's entire trade. So, in numerical terms, there's basically no change. Superpower reliance, and also this is, as I said before, because of Cuba being a resource-poor nation, this is basically to be expected. And according to the Platform for Innovation and Dialogue with Cuba, the Soviet Union sold oil to Cuba at very generous below market prices and then allowed Cuba to re-export this oil to the world market, which then generated hard currency, which was worth more than 40% of the country's total revenues, which is twice the share that their principal commodity, being sugar, generated. And in 1987, the Soviet Union paid Cuba the equivalent of 0.4 US dollars per pound for imported sugar, when the average world market price was 0.06. So, very generous. But, in spite of this in spite of this trade reliance, Cuba and the ever rebellious, much loved and much hated Fidel Castro decided to chart his own course. When the Soviet Union geopolitically went one way, Cuba often went another. Cuba, for example, during the 60s and 70s, when the USSR was interested in a period of economic and political détente with the USA, a bit of a slowdown on the arms race and the proxy wars, etc., Cuba decided that it would support all sorts of communist left-wing movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, most famously in Angola, Ethiopia, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Chile. Bolivia is where Che Guevara died while attempting to incite a revolution there, and there were lots of Cuban troops on the ground in both Angola and Ethiopia. So Cuba basically managed to avoid the fate of the Eastern European countries, which became complete satellite states, and their dependence was shown obviously when Hungary and Czechoslovakia tried to leave the bloc, to devastating consequences. And so Cuba sort of charted its own third way. It avoided vassalage, but still depended heavily economically on the Soviet Union. Until 1991 happens. And again, we see that Cuba, of the contrast that I find so fascinating and that I love so much about Cuba, rearing its head again. So, Soviet Union falls, as do its European allies. The Soviet Union then becomes Russia and various other states, and they stop providing Cuba with oil. They stop buying Cuban sugar at incredibly generous prices. And in the midst of all this, since 1960, the US has enacted punitive economic sanctions on Cuba because of their geopolitical falling out. And now Cuba has to face that pressure alone, and to make matters worse, basically sensing blood in the water, the US introduced a couple of acts, the Torricelli and the Helms-Burton Acts, which intensified the embargo, basically making it extraterritorial in the sense that third countries doing business with Cuba, which have some sort of tangential link to the US in commercial terms, could be sanctioned. A good example is any ship that docked in Cuba could not dock in an American port for 180 days after docking in Cuba. I went to Cuba in 2022. I've not been to the United States since, and I think it would be very, very difficult, especially in the current circumstances with Trump, to go. Anyway, so what happened? Fidel did not decide to give up, because that's not really in his nature. So he attempted to tailor economic reality to his political ambitions of continued geopolitical independence. He declared a special period in the time of peace, and bread allocations were reduced to 80 grams per person per day. Gas sales to all Cuban individuals were suspended, and blackouts lasted up to 20 hours a day. On average, in the first few years, Cubans lost about 9 kilos. Responding to those food shortages that came about as a result of drastic reduction in trade, instead of opening up the Cuban economy, the Cubans in cities developed these things called organoponicos, which were basically urban farms. In the 90s and 2000s, Havana's residents converted 135 square miles of the capital using rooftops, apartments, whatever they could, and they made it into agriculturally productive land. And to make up for fuel shortages, spare part shortages, 500,000 bicycles were also produced in Cuba to keep the workforce working. State also began to invest heavily in tourism. Old hotels were remodeled, small airports refurbished, international travel started flooding to Cuba because Fidel Castro realized that the one thing that the USSR and the USA and other powers could not control is how pristine these beaches look all year round. And he was ultimately very, very successful in using tourism to bolster the Cuban economy in an incredibly difficult time. Between 1990 and 1999, the Cuban government invested more than $3.5 billion in the industry, and as a result, between 1990 and 2005, visitors to Cuba increased from 340,000 per year to about 2.4 million. That number has fluctuated a bit. It's down now for various reasons, which we might discuss. But during the Obama era, where there was a renormalization of relations, there was a flood of American tourists because, as we saw pre-1959, what's not to love about Cuba if you're American, except now for communism, obviously. So, what saved Cuba was the growth of tourism, limited internal economic liberalization. There was this gradual scaling back of the prohibition of private business, and eventually another power started to fill the void. Venezuela came in 2000. They signed a very generous oil agreement with Cuba, but it is worth saying that this is not the same as the superpower alliance that had defined Cuba for so long. Cuba, the Venezuelans had a terrible healthcare system. Cuba had an excellent medical training program. They developed this sort of doctors for oil deal, and also Chavez and Fidel Castro were very much aligned on the big, most important issues. So crucially, no great power alliance, no American companies back in, no Washington consensus, no collapse or color revolution or anything like that. So, because we've spoken about the trade sanctions in so much detail, I think it's worth going into them in a little bit more detail. So, start off with, I'm just going to quickly explain the photos. Now, I've recently come back from Colombia as a dual British-Italian citizen. I was using Colombian internet, Colombian Wi-Fi to try to book an Airbnb in Cuba. And you can all try this on your phones right now. If you do that, you're going to have to tell the US Treasury, the US Department of Treasury, why you're going. You're going to have to tell them the purpose of your trip. You cannot put tourism. You have to say, you're going for a family visit, official government business, journalistic, professional research, educational, which is obviously mine. You can see various other reasons. There's one, support for the Cuban people. I would put that one if you ever go. That's vague enough that you can say, well, I was friendly while I was there. So, obviously you don't have to use Airbnb, but that is the most commonly used website, and it is American. Therefore, it is subject to US sanctions. Now, you will all recognize, I'm sure, the man in the photo there. That's JFK with his iconic Cuban cigar. Now, as you know, everything, the revolution, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened while he was in charge, and he was pivotal in implementing some of the sanctions against Cuba, including banning the import of Cuban cigars. Luckily for JFK, though, he managed to squeeze in an order of 1,200 of them just before putting the sanctions on. So one rule for us, another for them, as has ever been the case. And finally, this is a very interesting map that demonstrates the countries that voted to condemn the embargo, that voted against condemning the embargo, and that abstained during the most recent UN resolution on the US embargo against Cuba. Now, the reason it's particularly interesting is actually, surprisingly, this year was the most anti-Cuba, pro-US year in a while. Usually, there are two countries that vote against lifting the embargo, that is the US and Israel, and there are a couple of abstentions. But this year, because of the presence of Cuban mercenaries in Ukraine, a very, very controversial issue, and an intense US diplomatic campaign that was encouraged by Marco Rubio, who's himself of Cuban descent, to vote with the US on the embargo, a few staunch American allies in Europe and Latin America decided not to vote for the Cubans. The idea was the Cubans are allegedly supporting Russia. It's a whole nother topic, could be a whole nother presentation. It's very, very interesting, but not why we're here today. So that gives you a little bit of context about the sanctions. So the sanctions, I mean, by virtue of them coming from what I believe to be the most powerful nation to have ever existed in the history of humanity, I mean, already I think that speaks for itself. There is a debate about whether to call the sanctions an embargo or a blockade. The Cuban government and many others, friendly academics, call it a blockade. The official term by the US and the UN is an embargo. I'm not going to enter into that debate now, but I'm happy to talk about my position in the Q&A. But Cuba has effectively been cut off from the global economy. Its political position as a persona non grata in the eyes of the US means several things. Firstly, that trading with Cuba falls under the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act because Cuba is on the state sponsors of terrorism list, and they join, I think, Iran, North Korea, and a couple of others on that list. So for the American company Airbnb, facilitating recreational stays by non-US citizens on Cuban soil counts as trading with a terrorist enemy. US banks cannot process transactions for Cuba. Direct and indirect investments by US citizens into Cuba are banned. Most imports and exports of goods and services, with occasional exceptions for food and medicine, between the two countries are forbidden. And almost all global US dollar transactions are cleared through American financial institutions, meaning that Cuba is effectively cut off from the global financial system. Of course, now with BRICS trying to develop another system, and Cuba being a partner nation, perhaps that will change, but for now, the dominant global currency remains the dollar. The re-export of items of US origin from third countries to Cuba is also banned. But this is where the interesting extraterritorial bit comes in, because that does not just describe items exclusively manufactured in the US. Non-US origin items with more than what is termed de minimis US origin content are treated as US origin items. If the de minimis threshold is set at 50%, that means a product manufactured half in the US cannot be exported to Cuba. The threshold is 10%. So if 10% of this clicker, maybe the back or the sticker on the back or something, is made in the US, it cannot go to Cuba. That goes against the sanctions. And those sanctions are enforced. On October the 1st, 2020, Generali Global Assistance Incorporated, a US travel service provider, was fined for indirectly insuring Canadian tourists' trips to Cuba by both paying Canadian travelers for expenses incurred in Cuba and reimbursing its Canadian affiliates for payments directly to Cuba. The US company itself did not deal with Cuba in any respect. The company had to pay a $5.8 million fine But as each payment to, or in respect of, Canadian tourists was treated as a separate transaction and therefore potential infringement of the sanctions, the potential penalty for this particular US travel service provider could have reached $168 million for reimbursing Canadian tourists who committed the crime of going to Cuba. This also means other sanctions include subsidiaries of an American entity and 50-50 joint ventures of an American and a non-American fall under the same restrictions. Basically, if your business partner is American, no trade with Cuba. If your HQ is in the US, no trade with Cuba. And realistically, no commercial entity is going to the Cuban market and the US market think, yeah, we're going to the Caribbean. So, the losses for Cuba are enormous. Estimates vary a lot. The Cuban government says that they've lost the equivalent of trillions of dollars over several decades of the blockade. According to CARICOM, the political organization representing the Caribbean Community of Nations, according to their estimates, between March 2024 and February 2025 alone, Cuba suffered estimated material losses amounting to $7.5 billion US, which is the equivalent of about $20 million US a day. And the UN says that since the beginning of the embargo, Cuba has lost about 130 billion US. Not sure if that's adjusted for inflation, but either way, it's a hell of a lot of money. So, what's the situation now? Now, this photo was posted, it's an AI generated photo, posted by a pretty hopeful US congressman called, I believe it was Carlos Jimenez. As his name suggests, he is Cuban American, and one thing that you can count on with the Cuban Americans in Florida is they're probably going to support regime change. And so he posted on his X account an image of what Cuba might look like and all the company headquarters. There's Airbnb, where it wouldn't let me book a tourist trip to Cuba. McDonald's, Shell, Exxon, various car companies, Tiffany. I mean, it's a paradise. That is another AI-generated photo of a Trump Tower in the Revolution Square. This is the mural to Jose Marti, the hero of the Cuban independence. No confirmations that Trump wants Trump Towers there, but I think that, we know Trump. Anyway, and this is Raúl Castro, brother of Fidel Castro and the current Cuban president Miguel Díaz-Canel, in their military fatigues. They basically are not seen outside of their military fatigues nowadays because Cuba has officially transitioned into a state of preparation for war. As all of you will know, Maduro, long-standing Venezuelan president, long-time Cuban ally, was just captured by US Special Forces. One of the first decisions that was made by the government that replaced Maduro was to stop sending oil to Cuba, and Cuba didn't get much in the first place. Trump has since then threatened to impose sanctions on any country that dares to supply Cuba with oil. That includes Mexico, who pledged to continue providing Cuba with oil. Russia recently said that they would fill the void. It's uncertain whether that will actually happen. Now, this is unconfirmed, but ABC News, relatively reliable source in Mexico, has suggested that there are currently, as we speak, negotiations between Raúl Castro's son, who is a prominent intelligence officer, colonel in the army, and the CIA. The idea would be, instead of doing a regime change operation like Maduro's, instead of bombing Cuba, instead of a direct military intervention, keep everything as it is, but American companies would flood it into the tourist, energy, telecommunications, and there was another sector as well. But basically, opening up the economy to the Americans and leaving the state as it is to avoid a migration crisis, because that MAGA doesn't like that. So, in conclusion, perhaps this 3-decade Cuban experiment of autarky is about to reach its end, and perhaps the inevitability of globalization and the corresponding necessity to integrate oneself into the global economy that still largely revolves around the United States, Cuba's principal foe. and the necessity of having American trade has finally caught up with the island. But boy, they gave it a good run. And if the fallout from tariffs and Trump's trade war shows anything, it's that American trade policy still holds a lot of weight in the current world, and no nation knows this better than Cuba. So this is basically the option that faces Cuba, in my opinion. Cuba is full of these CDRs. They are Comités de Defensa de la Revolución. They are basically organizations set up in every small town, city, that help the local community and benevolently report counter-revolutionary activities to just make sure that everyone is as enthusiastic as they should be for the Cuban Revolution. I chose this photo because, as you can see, the mural is sort of crumbling. It's surrounded by dilapidated buildings, which unfortunately is what Havana looks like today. So that's the geopolitics option. That's the option of continued independence. Or we'll probably get casinos, resorts, American tourists, hotels, maybe a Trump Tower. I don't know. I'm not sure that the Cubans would be very happy with that, but what choice would they have? But before we finish, it is worth noting that Cuba's isolation from the global economy is not entirely externally imposed. The majority of Cuba's hard currency revenue is controlled by Gaesa, a business conglomerate that's run by the Cuban military. Even when the Cuban population has suffered, Gaesa's profits have significantly increased. If you go to Havana, there are sort of 2 or 3 incredibly plush, lovely neighborhoods where the reality of economic collapse is not yet being felt, and people who live there are invariably, they're the sons and grandsons of the Castros and the Guevaras, and people related to the military. So take from that what you will. And the Institute for War and Peace reports that for every $1 of remittances sent by Cubans abroad to their family, there's a massive Cuban diaspora that's fled the country. They often send money back to their families. 74 cents of every $1 goes into the pockets of Gaesa, this Cuban military conglomerate. This corruption isn't the only thing that contributes to Cuba's image as a very business and trade hostile environment. Regulations also contribute. So there are regulations which dictate how much fish Cuban citizens can catch. And Cuban citizens are fined 10,000 pesos, which is the equivalent of 2.5 months' salary, if they dare to use nets when fishing. This is private citizens who might live by the sea. I mean, I went to a market because I had to buy some food. I went to buy some fish. It was awful, terrible quality, full of flies, basically on the verge of rotting. And I would look out to the sea, and you'd have these people just fishing on their own, catching these incredible tuna, but they can't sell them unless it's on the black market or unless they do it discreetly. Because of Cuban government regulations, aversion to private business, state control. As a Cuban farmer, you have little to no choice about what you can grow on your land, as the state will dictate this to you. If you're lucky enough to be a private farmer, of which there are now a few since Raul Castro's liberalization, you have to meet state quotas for production and sell 80% of your produce to the state. So heavy, bureaucratic, state-led and militarized control of Cuba's trade has not exactly endeared it to external investors. I've spoken with a lot of people who have something to do with Cuba. I've spoken to a lot of ex-British ambassadors. One of them said, we are very sympathetic to the Cuban cause. We try to get more investment in, but the Cubans, they are very, very vigilant, constantly watching over your shoulder. And the people who are especially not endeared are the EU, for example. So the EU sends large humanitarian funds to Cuba, a controversial issue that has come under criticism from the current Trump administration, but there are lots of checks and balances, there are lots of regulations on how that money can be used, and the continuation of humanitarian funds is dependent on the Cuban government producing results. It's also obviously worth noting that the term autarky, which is this idea of complete self-reliance, no foreign trade, it was the dream of Adolf Hitler in the late 1930s, it's not perfectly suited to describing the Cuban situation over the last couple of decades, especially since the turn of the century. Cuba has relied heavily on oil from Venezuela, as I mentioned before, on humanitarian funds from the EU, and a renewal of interest in trade with the island by the US's traditional adversaries, most notably Russia and China, though it remains to be seen whether they can provide enough aid. I mean, China has produced some humanitarian aid to Cuba recently. Russia has said that they'll keep funding, supplying them with oil. The reality is Russia and China are going to risk direct confrontation with the US over Cuba. They like it as a nuisance, but it's no longer holds the same importance that it did during the Cold War. It's also difficult to claim complete self-sufficiency and self-reliance if your economy heavily depends on the temporary presence of holidaymakers from various parts of the world on your shores. Having an entire economy based on the whims of holidaymakers is not necessarily a sustainable strategy, and it's been seen recently. Tourists are very, very easily spooked, and the current situation in Cuba is putting off even the most resilient of tourists. There has been an increase in Chinese and Russian tourists, but mainly they come from Spain, the EU, and Canada, and the recent situation, Trump's threats, the Maduro operation, the lack of oil, the fact that foreign flights landing in Cuba can now not refuel in some cases means that flights have been cancelled. So the situation is pretty bleak. But I wanted to finish, despite those caveats, by saying that the reason that, to come back to why I'm talking about Cuba in the context of geopolitics and trade, the reason that this is such an unprecedented and interesting case study is that Cuba has managed to survive in this position of isolation, forced isolation by the most powerful nation on the planet, without the enormous record-breaking oil reserves of Venezuela, although they do have some small oil reserves, without the proximity to a friendly nation, being China, enjoyed by North Korea, and without the enormous resources, population, and quantity of arable land of Russia, China, and Iran. Geopolitics and trade have long been at loggerheads in Cuba, but, like I said before, as reports of negotiations flood in, as the hawks in Washington gather the clouds of regime change once again, which is probably going to happen a lot over the next 2 or 3 years, it seems, at least to me, that this very ambitious but ultimately doomed project of self-sufficiency, autarky, in a world of increasing global integration, global trade, is about to come to its end. With that, I think, thank you very much for listening.